Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Redistricting, What Your Community Needs to Know. I'm Melissa Keene. I'm a Senior Program Manager with the Institute for Local Government, and I will be your moderator and host this morning. Redistricting is a complex process that may be challenging to explain to your residents. This process will be further complicated by the fact that local governments are still working to navigate virtual and hybrid public meetings and engagement activities. This webinar will share new outreach rules and tips and strategies to effectively communicate and engage with your residents on redistricting topics. A quick overview of today's agenda. Obviously, we're doing the welcome right now, and then we're going to go through some introductions and some context setting. We're going to hear presentations from our two panelists today, and then we're going to engage in a panel discussion with our panelists, and then wrap up with some questions from the audience, and close with our contact information and some other upcoming webinars that you all might be interested in. You might have noticed that your line is muted, and you will remain muted for the duration of today's webinar, but that doesn't mean you can't ask us questions. So you should see a questions box in your navigation control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can drop questions into that box at any point in time, and we'll be monitoring those on the back end. And then, as I just mentioned, we'll get to as many audience questions as we can towards the end of today's webinar. A couple of other housekeeping items to share with you all is that we are recording today's webinar, and it will be distributed out to all of the registrants likely later this week. And we will also share the slide deck with you all at that time as well. So a little bit of information about ILG in case you're not super familiar with us. We are the nonprofit training and education affiliate of the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. And we provide practical and easy-to-use resources so local agencies can effectively implement policies on the ground. We do this in a number of ways. We do a lot of education and training, like today's webinar. We also do a lot of conference sessions and in-person trainings with jurisdictions statewide. We also provide technical assistance, capacity building, and convening services to our local government partners around the state. We focus on 4 main subject matter areas. We have a program on leadership and governance, which covers a lot of the basics that you all need to know or your newly elected officials need to know. We do the state mandated trainings in this space, and then do a lot of work around effective governance and effective governance teams and how to facilitate those conversations and really encourage your councils and your staff to work together as a team. We have a program focused on civics education and workforce, which helps create the pipeline to public service and really facilitate municipal school partnerships, and essentially encourage young folks to think about local government as a career path. We have a program focused on public engagement, which really is targeted at helping local governments embed public engagement into their operations and tackle some of those challenging conversations, whether they're around housing or climate or a whole host of other things that you all need to engage with your community on. And then lastly, we have a program focused on sustainable communities. Right now, we're working a lot around housing, climate action, and we also have a program that's focused on honoring the voluntary efforts of cities and counties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, save energy, and implement sustainability best practices. Before we jump in, just wanted to share a little bit of context about what we at ILG are hearing in the field from our local government partners around virtual engagement and some of the challenges and benefits that we're seeing. So a lot of folks recently are having a hard time trying to navigate this hybrid engagement and reopening process. Obviously, everybody had to make the switch pretty quickly last year to a virtual world and really embraced that and took that on pretty quickly. But now as we're reopening, trying to find that sweet spot between the virtual engagement opportunities as well as some of the in-person things that are becoming available again, it's just a challenge in trying to figure out what that right balance is. And so that's something that we're going to be tackling a little bit today. I'm sure a lot of you have seen actually increased participation in a virtual environment. Folks obviously find it pretty easy to not have to go to City Hall or the boardrooms and be able to engage in public meetings from their homes. Get the kids fed into bed and then can log on to a city council meeting as opposed to having to drive to City Hall on a Tuesday night to participate in those meetings. So there's definitely been an ease of access, and a lot of folks are engaging that hadn't previously engaged in this world, which is great. The flip side of that coin, though, is it also has exacerbated some of the digital divide issues that our local government partners are trying to work through. particularly in more rural areas of the state, really highlighting the fact that not everybody has access to broadband, and trying to navigate that and get folks connected and online when they may not have either internet access or the devices that they need to really engage there. We're seeing a lot of unique things that local governments are doing in terms of trying to address that and partnering with community-based organizations, nonprofits, to either provide those hotspots and internet access, or in some cases actually provide the devices needed for folks to connect and participate in these digital meetings. Another challenge we're hearing is that it can be hard to make virtual engagement activities interactive, and so we can definitely share some tips on that front later today if that's of interest as well. There are definitely ways that we can help combat that. So that's just a little bit about kind of the context that we're operating from and what we're hearing as you all are trying to embark on this redistricting engagement process. So our presenters this morning are Ryder Smith, who's the president with Tri-Peppy Smith, and Mark Jomsky, the city clerk with the city of Pasadena. I just want to take a moment to thank Ryder and his team for making this webinar possible and their partnership with ILG for a number of years. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ryder to kick things off. Ryder?
Thank you very much, Melissa. I appreciate that. And I just want to take a moment to also express my appreciation for the Institute for Local Government. You know, one of the things I've learned in the 100+ agencies that we get to work with across California is that a lot of the communication challenges we're seeking to address today and educate the public on, I think, are rooted at times in the lack of civics education in our traditional curriculum, and that having kind of become a secondary educational point. But organizations like Institute for Local Government, I think, are a critical resource for the state of California in helping to close that gap and do the work that otherwise might not be done in our traditional schooling environment. So I appreciate the work of ILG, and that's why we've been longtime supporters of the Institute. I'm really thankful also that Mark was able to join us today for this conversation about redistricting and the state of affairs. He'll talk more about the great city of Pasadena and the work they're doing there. It's really an extensive amount of outreach, kind of a gold standard from my perspective in terms of just how committed they are to that process, and the amount of effort and resources they're putting into it. By no means is it a requirement. They're going above and beyond, but we'll get into some of those details today. And then just a little bit of context so you understand the comment that I'm making today and where I'm coming from. First of all, Tri-Peppy Smith is a marketing communications firm. We have 32 members of our team, so a pretty decent sized public affairs organization, mostly focused on the state of California, mostly working with city governments. Also, we do work with some special districts, water agencies, and some counties as well. And we cover the entire state of California. And then specific to redistricting, we're involved in about 20+ agencies right now doing the outreach component of redistricting, and I'll talk about that more extensively here in a bit, but we're definitely seeing a lot of different approaches and actions that are helping to inform some of the comments I had today. Should we go to the next slide, or should we pause and give Mark, why don't you take a couple minutes just to introduce yourself real quick, and then we'll get on with the rest of my slides and we'll cut to yours if that works for you.
Sure. Thanks, Ryder. Thanks for the introduction. Mark Jomsky, City Clerk for the City of Pasadena. I will cover a lot about what we are doing in terms of engagement and outreach for the Pasadena's redistricting effort. We have a consultant team that's put together to help us with outreach. We also have a technical consultant team that is helping to guide us through the process, and I'll cover that during my presentation. But I've been with the City of Pasadena for 16 years. I've been the city clerk for 13 years. So I've been through one previous redistricting effort here in Pasadena. So this one is definitely unique in comparison with COVID-19 and the impacts of the compressed timeline that's been caused by COVID-19 and the release of census data. And I'll talk a little bit about that and how we've tried to mitigate that and move our task force and our city council through the process. With that, Ryder, I'll turn it back over to you. Thanks.
All right, we'll go to the next slide. So broad strokes, I'm sure many of the folks that are involved in this call have some interest in redistricting, so you're probably familiar with these dates, but let's just set the kind of timeline reality here, right? So before adoption of any maps, agencies have to do extensive outreach plans. This is now codified into the law in the state of California, particularly for cities and counties. You must collect data and communities of interest information, conduct public forums, mostly the 4 required hearings, but workshops are also kind of a plus up that you can do as part of that process. There are draft maps that need to be available, first of all, for the public to draft some maps, and then ultimately hire technical assistance or the public agency themselves can produce some additional maps to submit as part of the consideration process. And there's various channels that agencies are using to get to the end game of map adoption. But fundamentally, they are hitting hard dates, right? So if you're a city or county, you're looking at June 22nd, 2022 elections, you have a December due date that you need to hit. That's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You gotta hit that date, end of story, right? So there's no deferral for 3 months and figure it out later. For cities and counties that are facing November 2022 elections, you got a little bit more reprieve when you're pushed out to April. So there's really kind of 2 concurrent waves that are going on, especially with the counties right now and some agencies driving hard towards that December date. And then there'll be a second wave of these adoptions to happen. And then you have school districts and special districts as well that have dates that are coming up. Their dates are a little, their processes are not as demanding in the requirements that they're placed upon them compared to, particularly for the outreach work specifically, that is required for counties and cities. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So there are obviously some significant costs, and this is something that comes up all the time with agencies. So I just want to put some stakes in the ground and set some parameters for what seems like these things should cost and give some sense of the teams that are involved. Generally speaking, when a clerk or a city manager calls me up fresh and says, hey, we have to do this redistricting thing, what can you tell me? I say there are three legs to the stool. There's going to be some legal counsel with specialty skills or at least awareness of the California Voting Rights Act, the Fair Maps Act, and the legal compliance issues around drawing districts. Second, there's going to be a demographer. It's a technical consultant who's in charge of drafting the lines and making sure that they meet those legal requirements, and they provide a lot of the public, the subject matter expertise in the public information campaign. And then your third leg of that stool is going to be an outreach consultant. Now, as a consultant, of course, I think everything is a communications issue, and therefore you should hire consultants. But I would certainly say that of those 3, communications consultant is kind of the most optional of those 3. Many agencies are choosing to opt for it because it's a one-time big spike of work that disappears, kind of an ideal consulting situation to work in. But if you have sufficient in-house resources with your public information officer and team and some good close collaboration with a demographer, you can get through this process. It is possible to get through the process without engaging outside help and support. But it is a very spiky demand in need. Generally speaking, when you look at some of those, so your city attorney costs, if that's in-house legal costs, maybe it's already a sunk cost with salaries, maybe you can get through the process without it. If you need a specialized outside legal counsel or you have some very tricky legal issues, I can't speak for what attorneys will cost ultimately to get through that process, but it certainly can get expensive or not be that significant. Demographer costs can vary substantially. Those costs are going to be a function of how many meetings are you having, how many times are going to be presenting to council or to board of supervisors, what mapping tools are you going to be using and enabling and empowering your public with. So those factors can all drive towards this $30,000 to $150,000 cost for a demographer. And those costs, particularly around the frequency of meetings, is going to be impacted by, are you pursuing an independent commission route, a advisory commission route, or just going straight to your elected board to have them handle the hearings and the process directly. And then there's the outreach cost, right? So just going off our experience of what we generally bid, you're looking usually between $30,000 and $150,000 in costs to get through the process. That's in baseline project management, a couple of hearings, support for press releases, outreach support, social media management, graphic design to kind of take care of this process. And then depending upon how many meetings and how many press releases and how much work and how involved you are, those costs can go up towards $150,000. Let's go to the next slide. So as I noted, there are 3 different pathways to redistricting. And I think one thing I should note, especially going back and thinking about the timeline, is we are all facing this challenge this year of the census having been delayed in getting the results. Right now, we're expecting late August, early September for the census to make the data available to the state of California, but the state of California has their own magical pixie dust they need to do in terms of reallocating the state prison population, which is going to cause another up to 30-day delay. So our best estimates right now are sometime in early October, late September at best, that actual census data is going to be available to let us draw actual maps with real data. So that has just created an entire shift in timeline. And I bring that up now just because these different processes are affected by that timeline and how fast they're going to have to scramble to get through the process. The other thing to note too is if you're a December due date agency, because you have April, you have a June elections that you need to be ready for, then you're also looking at a particularly expedited timeline because you basically have to start drawing maps and adopt those maps by December, starting in October. So you only have like 2.5 months to get through that process. Very challenging thing to get through. We're generally seeing these three standard approaches, right? Council, Board of Supervisors is the only entity that's rendering a decision and directing the map drawing process. They're holding public hearings. This process is certainly the most efficient. It's the fastest pathway to get towards adoption. And it does mean that the elected leaders themselves are ultimately charged with choosing the districts. In some cases, we are seeing advisory commissions form. So these advisory commissions are non-elected official citizens. Either they're drawn through a random drawing or they apply and are appointed by each member of the elected board or a council. But somehow you assemble this commission, and this advisory commission will go through and hold some of the public hearings. They can't hold all of them. They'll hold some of the public hearings and provide guidance to the elected board, perhaps for the recommendation of a couple maps. They facilitate the community of interest information and essentially manage that process. So that's kind of like independent commission light. And then we have the full independent redistricting commission. And the key defining element here is that that commission itself is in a position to select the maps and define the maps, and the maps never make it to your elected board for actual adoption. Whereas with the advisory commission, it ultimately goes to the board or the county city council, and they'll adopt. So in that independent commission route, you're usually looking at the most demanding work for staff and for consultants to help support that commission, but it is fully detached from the elected officials, and all the hearings and whatnot can be handled outside of your traditional board of supervisors or city council process, for example. So those are the three basics we see. You could well imagine that in terms of staff demand times and communication and redistricting consulting costs, as you move from left to right, you're looking at more effort, more energy, more cost to get those things done. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about generating community engagement. So first and foremost, we are looking at more planning and outreach than ever before. This has been dictated by state law and the Fair Maps Act, that there has to be a significant amount of community outreach that happens. And of course, we want that, right? So it's not like we're being dragged to the trough to make this happen. Every agency we get to work with has expressed a sincere commitment to wanting that outreach. They want to hear about key term communities of interest in their community. So that the demographer and the elected board of supervisors or the independent redistricting commission is well informed about what's going on. So we want that engagement. We want to hear from people, and a lot of the work that we're doing right now are really focused around trying to provide as many channels as possible to open that up. And I kind of view this is a four-phase process, right? So the first one being community education on the district formation process. This process happens every 10 years. Or I should say either district formation or reformation if we're redistricting, of course. With it happening every 10 years, you don't expect your public to be fully ingrained in how this process works. So we really need to make sure we are taking the time to explain that process to them and empower them. Then we want to make sure we're getting feedback and engagement on those communities of interest. And we're trying to do a lot of that work on the front end before we even have the census data, so we can get through this process in a timely fashion once the census data is out. Once you actually get through the district creation process, we see this as the next phase. So this now post-map adoption, the kind of third phase we see, having gone through all the education, gone through the adoption, is getting the candidates informed, the potential candidates informed about what these new district lines are, so they know where they run and how they run and what district they would be in. And you want to make sure you generate candidates. And then finally is a resident voter education process. So even after you've adopted those maps, the fun with redistricting doesn't end, because now you need to make sure the public knows where are those new lines, what district are they in, and make sure that they're properly understanding their new governance structure in their agencies. Next slide. When we look at what it takes to develop a successful outreach plan, there are just some few things I want to highlight here, and I'll leave it to the Q&A to get into some more details. First one is making sure that you're rotating different dates and times when you're holding your public hearings and your forums and your workshops to allow for variability. So you're looking at weekends, evenings, during the day, various times to account for different audiences so everybody feels like they have a fair chance to participate. That would also include rotating locations as well. If you're particularly dealing with a county with a lot of diversity, a lot of geographic territory, you want to try to provide some options for people to be accessible within a reasonable driving distance. Second thing is you need to consider your various needs of your community. This has a lot to do with language, which is of course dictated by a Secretary of State in terms of which languages you may be required to provide translation for if requested, or many agencies are just proactively saying, these are the 3 languages we know we need to commit to. So we're going to stick with those languages, just automatically offer interpretation and go above and beyond what the legally bare minimum requirements are. Targeting your hard to reach communities is obviously an important thing to do. I think there were a ton of lessons learned during the census process about how to reach those communities. And we're often working with the exact same folks who led the census outreach efforts in districts and agencies to actually work with them on that same outreach process to try to reach some of those hard to reach communities. As I noted, we already talked about translation services, and just kind of a tip here, the Zoom broadcast in particular, or Zoom platform, has one of the most effective language interpretation capabilities around. So if you're doing hybrid meetings or purely virtual meetings, Zoom is almost the kind of de facto standard to be on these days for getting this done. Doesn't mean you can't use Teams or some of the other popular platforms, but that one in particular is just the most versatile for the needs that are out there, and likely the one the public is most familiar with. And then lastly, I note this need to leverage community partnerships. So that's not only leveraging, say, other agencies that are a part of the community. So say you have a water district that overlaps your city that you want to partner up with, or it may be a special district that's out there that has some influence on your district. But you also want to look at your nonprofits in the community. In fact, we've been, as part of our outreach campaigns, we'll go and get that list of nonprofit organizations and start making phone calls and actually calling people at those organizations to make sure they're aware of the process, aware of the website, and are trying to tell their communities that they work with and represent about process. Next slide. So as I know, just some key outreach tools. Public hearings and forums are the 2 biggies. So public hearings are usually more formalized and structured. They're in front of the board that ultimately makes the decision about the maps. Forums is also a different term for workshops, and we see those as much more interactive. They're like a traditional community forum, less structured, quorum not required. You certainly put things on the record there, but you're really looking to foment conversation engagement in those conversations. We see social media as being a critical tool, as always with communications, right? It's a content times distribution equals impact question. You get a lot of distribution on social media for very cost-effective money. And that's not only leveraging, we're going to leverage all the existing city and county platforms that would be available to try to reach those populations. And then I would also note the website remains a key platform. Unique to this news cycle is that for cities and counties, you need to keep those websites online for 10 years. This can be subpages on your existing agency website, or it can be a completely standalone dedicated website focused on the issue. The secondary option route there, going a dedicated website, sometimes a lot of clerks are nervous about essentially having content on their existing website and fearing that it may disappear if they do a website redo from 5 years from now, and suddenly they lose that content that needs to be there for the full 10 years. So a number of agencies are opting to just go for a standalone website that they can just kind of sequester off from the rest of their organization's website, so they know it's there in a lockbox, so to speak, as Al Gore would say, so that you aren't taking that away unexpectedly 5 years from now. Next slide. So Mark is really going to speak to this case study, but as I noted, the city of Pasadena is kind of checking the boxes in a number of the areas I noted on outreach, and he can provide some great detail about where they're going. As noted here too, obviously that census data is not released yet, so we're urging agencies to be moving forward regardless, trying to get all their community information done, all their outreach and education done, start developing that list of communities of interest, and really build up that kind of almost a what's the word I'm looking like, a catapult of redistricting activities. So you get all that stress ready to go, get all that public educated. So by the time you hit that go line in early October and we have data, we're off to the races very quickly, and we have a public who's already educated on the issues. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Mark and let him walk you through what's going on in the great city of Pasadena.
Thanks, Ryder. Good information, good presentation. If we want to go to the first slide for Pasadena. So again, Mark Jomsky, Pasadena City Clerk. At the bottom right, you see our redistricting consultant teams. We have Allegra Consulting and Trepepi Smith teaming up to help us with the outreach. We noted in the Fair Maps Act that the extensive outreach that was going to be required with this effort. And so we actually hired a local firm, which is Allegra Consulting and Trepepi Smith, which has a good background and experience in working to promote and help support outreach for redistricting. So we engage both consulting teams. We also have our technical consultants, National Demographics Corporation, who is helping to lead the task force and our city council through this process. I just note we've come up with what we like as a colorful and catchy logo that we have been trying to put on all of our redistricting information as we do outreach so that the community can identify when we're putting out information to them. Next slide. So a little background on the city of Pasadena. We're located in the San Gabriel Valley in Southern California. We have an estimated population of 141,000. Our city council is comprised of a mayor who's elected at large and 7 council members who are elected by district. We have a 12-member redistricting advisory task force. They were appointed by the city council to recommend a redistricting plan to the council. The council can modify the plan or accept it as submitted. The plan is adopted by ordinance, and that's per our city charter. Again, NDC is our professional redistricting consulting and demographer team that is contracted to guide the task force and the city council through the process. Our outreach consulting team of Allegra and of Trepepi Smith are hired to focus on outreach, transparency, and public engagement to ensure compliance with the Fair Maps Act. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this is just some population and demographics data for the city of Pasadena. On the left is the 2010 population counts. Third column in is the population counts that we have estimated. This is the population counts that we're sort of putting out as we do our community workshops, and we are telling everyone these will change because obviously the population data is not available yet. And then as you work your way across the table there, you see some of the demographics percentages for the city by district, and at the bottom in bold, total for the city. So we have a large Hispanic population in the city. White and African American and Asian American populations are significant in the city as well. Next slide, please. So as we're all, trying to make our way through these deadlines, and we have been making this slide a key slide when we go out into the public to talk about the impacts of COVID-19. It's important for the public to be aware of and to level set the expectations of what this process will be like as we move through it. If you look at the middle column, we should have had 4 to 6 months of dealing with the data and helping the public work through what are potential changes by district in populations as we shift and try and equalize those populations as is required. But if you look at the right, and as Ryder has already indicated, we are looking at mid to late August based on our consultant team, mid to late August for the census to release population data. And then the California, we've heard mid to late September. We're hoping mid September because any further delays, and that is really going to impact our timeline. The driving force, of course, is our June 7, 2022 primary, where we have City Council Districts 3, 5, and 7 scheduled for election, and so we have to get everything done and adopted by the December 15th deadline. So that's the deadline that we're working with. Next slide. So with the task force and with the consultant team, we came up with a redistricting schedule that we hope will help meet all the deadlines and sort of, preload some of the information to the public and to the task force. The task force has already held 4 regular meetings or business meetings of the task force where they received training and education from the city attorney's office and from the technical consulting team. And now we've moved into the June and August community workshops where we're focusing in on the education and outreach to the public on redistricting. And we are focusing in on front loading some of that work of soliciting input on communities of interest, which are the building blocks for the districts. So we ask the public to submit testimonials or maps, or we have online mapping tools where they can submit input on communities of interest in the city. We will be hosting or holding a initial public hearing of the task force. This is that first public hearing prior to any of the mappings taking place as is required by the California Fair Maps Act. So that'll be on August 19th, which is coming up quick. We have the data coming up after that. And then the task force really has that sprint to try and come to consensus around a redistricting map and redistricting plan to submit to the council for recommendation. The public submits drafts, the technical consultants creates drafts, and hopefully over the course of the 5 Saturdays that we have scheduled, we are going to have the task force meet weekly to try and get this work done in a very compressed way and try and make sure that the public is very aware of this compressed timeline so that we are, again, level setting the expectations of what we can do in terms of community engagement at the task force level before we go to the council. The city council will then receive a final report and a recommended plan in November and start to hold council public hearings during the course of mid-November to mid-December before the December 15th, 2021 deadline. They receive the plan, they can discuss it, possibly revise it in certain areas, and then adopt by ordinance the final map and redistricting plan. We put up a full schedule of these meetings that we've held and will be holding on our cityofpasadena.net/redistricting webpage. Next slide, please. So I thought it would be good for the group, at least just to give you the case study of Pasadena redistricting over time, because it sort of helps to inform how it might affect our redistricting as we move into the 2021 redistricting task force. First, our redistricting timeline was compressed not only by COVID-19, but because we actually changed election timing, as did many cities, to coincide with statewide dates. So instead of having redistricting ending on, let's say, 2022 for the 2023 city council elections, we are now having to finish before the 2022 elections. So starting in 1982, you see our map here. It's a fairly normal looking map, I would say, as some people would, when you look at different districts, you see how it's regular in shape in most of the districts. However, there were problems with this map, and actually in the next map that I'm going to show you, there were some significant changes made in the districts between the 1982 adoption and the 1992 adoption. The key issue was the protection of minority voting rights in 1992 that led to that adoption of the 1992 map. As you look at this map, pay attention to districts 1 in pink, 2 in blue, and 4. They are going to shift east, and district 5 in green is going to shift significantly west, and district 6 is actually going to expand north. So let's move forward to the 92 map, and you'll see the changes. Now, what this was done for was the focus of the 92 redistricting task force was to protect the minority voting rights. And so District 1 captures the African American voting population in that district. District 3 also captures minority voting rights issues. And then District 5 was a Latino district that was created to maximize Latino voting rights. So go back to 82 again, just to show you again the shift, and then back to 92 of what was a really significant change to that map. Then as we move forward into 2002, you'll see just minimal changes to the districts. Maybe go back to 92 and then to 2002. And you see just some minimal changes to the district. The core of the districts were again maintained. Again, it's to protect the voting rights of the minority populations in Northwest Pasadena. And then in 2002 to 2012, go to the next slide. Again, just some minimal changes that were made. Again, equalizing population, protecting minority voting rights. Those were the criteria that was used as we moved forward in redistricting. Let's move to the next slide. So as we are going through our community workshops, we are focusing in on the legal requirements that are now part of the Fair Maps Act. We highlight that the federal law is first and foremost part of what are the legal requirements when we consider the redistricting in Pasadena and all the other agencies. The federal laws of ensuring equal population and compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act and protecting minority voting rights, preventing racial gerrymandering. And then we highlight to the public the rank order of the California law, contiguity, communities of interest, and I'll talk a little bit about that because that's really what we're focusing on right now with the community conversation, since we don't have the data, creating easily identifiable boundaries and maintaining compactness as a lower ranked goal. And we are not going to include political party information to avoid favoring or discriminating against political parties. We have been talking with the council and with the task force about these other goals that are traditional, but we have focused in on and emphasized that we must meet the federal and the state laws first before any of the other goals might be considered. And moving on to the next slide, this is one that we've used in our community workshops where we are focusing in on how the public can be engaged at this point with the data still waiting till mid to late August, that the public can still go ahead and give us some input and get informed on the redistricting process and defining communities of interest. And we're having them and encouraging the public to submit community of interest testimonies, community of interest maps, whatever way they want to let us know about their communities of interest and the building blocks of their communities of interest to ensure that if there are, we will minimize any impacts to those community of interest through redistricting, trying to minimize divisions, or if that's what that particular community of interest has advocated for. And then we, sort of part of our discussion with the community, next slide, we talk about what are potential communities of interest, and we note some of the popular ones that members of the public can understand because they're an engaged community and as part of Pasadena. So we talk about our commercial districts, our historic districts and neighborhood associations, and then general plan areas. So we have these interactive collection of maps that are available on our website that is provided by our technical consultant team. We have a paper map to make it more simple. And we actually have been distributing out the paper map with a questionnaire on the back so that the public can draw their community of interest and or just provide a written testimonial about why their community of interest, what is their community of interest and why it is important to be considered. So the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing so far since we concluded with our in-person or not in-person, our initial business meetings with our task force that were all held virtually because they were in May and in June. We held those virtually, and then we started to step out into the public to do these community workshops, and they have been hybrid. We've done Zoom and in person, and it's been the first time that the city of Pasadena has really gone out to in-person meetings with the public. I feel like we've done, a good balance in terms of providing this option to the public, whether they want to be there in person or whether they want to participate in Zoom. Our meetings have participation has been about 20 to 40 Zoom participants per meeting and about 12 to 25 participants in person. We've held one in each of the council districts, so we try to find a location that meets our technical requirements, because it's a difficult process to sort of bring out the Zoom meeting, bring out the and then be able to do socially distanced. So they have to have room size requirements. They have to have the technical requirements to plug into the internet and have a reliable connection to the internet to do the Zoom meeting. We've had pretty good luck in terms of technical issues. There have been few and far between. We've gone out and done a lot of walkthroughs with our team. That's including our Pasadena Media, which is a public access channel group that helps us with our meetings. We've had our Department of Information and Technology help us make sure that our Zoom meetings are set up and will be reliable. And we've gone to walk the site to make sure that the public will be safely spaced. We've required masks at all of these meetings because we are not asking for vaccination status as part of these meetings. We're just asking people to please, if you're going to come in person, to wear your mask, and have not received too much in terms of we've received a lot of cooperation in that regard. The public has been understanding and is actually just happy to be back out in public to attend these types of meetings. So our next meeting is actually tonight. We have one over here at the Pasadena Convention Center. This will be the 6th of the 7, and we have one scheduled for August 5th. And we've actually added an 8th one that will be an all Spanish workshop that will be conducted in all Spanish that we put on the schedule. It's come to focus in the last few days, so I didn't add it here, but it's on our website, and we are starting the outreach towards that end with that meeting. Next slide. So some of the sample outreach that we've done when we've gone to each district meeting, about 10 days ahead of that meeting, we send a direct mailer to each household in the district that there will be a meeting. Everyone's invited to the district meeting, but and we do push out email and social media ads and utilize contacts in the city that we have with local nonprofits, with our district liaisons, who are the council support staff for each of the council members, to push out emails and make sure that the public is receiving this information. But we have done the direct mailers to the district to ensure that each district gets notified of their opportunity to participate in any of these identical workshop meetings that we are hosting to give out information on redistricting. We've also been pushing out social media posts and engaging with that area prior to the meeting to boost some of the attendance. The dedicated redistricting webpage and the graphics and mailers all have similarities, and Allegra Consulting did a great job in helping us to sort of draft these, and Trepepi Smith have helped us to sort of inform these properly and make sure that this information is is easily digestible by the public and engaging and inviting to them to come to participate. And then we have a very robust and dedicated web page on redistricting that we utilized and been informed to make sure it's legal and compliant with the Fair Maps Act, and put up all the information. And we're really proud of it. We've gotten lots of compliments on it on that web page, and it's in English, Spanish, and we actually do some translation into Chinese as well, although that's going beyond what we're required based on what the Secretary of State's office has told us. It should be English and Spanish, and we've tried to do a little bit additional outreach because of some of the population that is growing for the Asian American population in the city. And with that, that will conclude my presentation.
Thanks, Mark.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryder and Mark, for your presentations. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of do a little bit of a hybrid panel discussion and audience Q&A here for you all. So just a reminder to the folks on the line, if you have any questions, we've seen a few come through, but if you have additional questions, please feel free to drop those into the questions box as we continue with this conversation. I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share here for a bit so that everybody can see our panelists. So to kick things off, I think you've both addressed this a little bit, but I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more to how the COVID restrictions and the virtual engagement requirements have been impacting this process. Are you all seeing more engagement than in previous cycles, or has it been more challenging having to do this in kind of a virtual and hybrid environment? Any tips or thoughts on the virtual engagement side of things?
Yeah, so I guess a couple comments. I think, first of all, we've seen that our independent commissions or boards or councils have shifted too, right? Because we've had councils that have now gone back into chambers, so they've changed up some logistics around those issues. So it's created a dynamic environment. There's no like standard, we started with this, we're going to stick with this process throughout. It's more like, well, we got to ebb and flow. And with the Delta variant coming back up, some councils and board of supervisors are changing course again and going back to maybe remote only in their meetings. Generally speaking, in working with the dozens of agencies we do in California, we saw more engagement overall than we'd ever seen before. And you alluded a little bit to this in your opening comments, Melissa, that it's easier for people to participate, right? Pants are kind of optional for them to be able to show up to a council meeting or a public hearing. So it's a lot easier to sit there and just chime in and dial in by phone. Obviously, so there's increased access and capability that comes through Zoom and other platforms. And I think the other thing I would just observe is, particularly with school districts, almost all of whom went with Zoom, it really pushed Zoom as a de facto standard for a lot of people to engage in content and be able to access Zoom. So whether it was children teaching their parents how to use Zoom because the kids were using Zoom on devices provided by the school district, or other platform or other methodologies, but it's really forced a lot of people to just kind of get Zoom-rific and participate in processes that way. So that, in some ways, COVID, a silver lining of COVID was that it helped get the public into at least more of the public into a standardized way to use digital communications like this for engaging with each other or engaging with their government. And that's been very helpful. And I feel like, particularly with geographies that are widespread, like say a big Fresno County or a big Merced County, you can get some geographic distance, and people who are on one end of the county or the other, which could be an hour plus, don't have to drive an hour to get to a public hearing. They can just show up. So overall, positive increase. There are some, from my perspective, some consequences there. When you get into hybrid meetings and you're trying to both work with people online and people who are in a room, and you're really trying to foment in a workshop environment, when I facilitate, I'm trying to get people to talk with their neighbors and talk among each other civilly. Obviously, the people who are remote have a much more difficult circumstance in that situation. And so that can actually tend to interrupt a little bit when you're trying to support the people who are remote and simultaneously work with the people who are in the room. Pasadena's, because of their commitment and their approach, have figured out how to make that work successfully for the way that they're handling some of their meetings. And I think in particular, and Mark could correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the actual kind of pause and talk to your neighbor element that we include in some of our workshops is not part of the current workflow that they have in their workshops they're doing in the districts right now. But that's been one of the areas that I think just creates a little bit more tension for us to participate. And then the last one is perhaps the obvious one, which is, well, what about those who don't have internet access, right? And so there are certainly mitigating factors there in terms of, there's libraries that have plenty of internet access. A lot of these kids have brought home internet access devices, even in very low income communities, they have some access that's been provided. But that there is always a in-person option that's been made available for people to participate in that method, or people to participate with a dial-in phone call if they so choose, because they don't have the ability to actually get on screen and do a video stream. So there are also some additional alternatives that are out there, and we generally are encouraging at least one pure, kind of in-person experience for folks to be able to participate in that, so that they don't have to have Zoom.
And I think Ryder really covered that pretty comprehensively, but I would just say that, putting on a Zoom and a hybrid meeting with the Zoom and virtual is, and I think all the agencies that are trying to do that, is not an easy task. We try to make it look easy. Now we want to make sure that the public thinks it looks easy, but it's not an easy task. There's probably a half a dozen staff members that have to attend these meetings in order to make it look seamless and that the public is able to participate in the manner that they feel most comfortable about or comfortable with, whether it's in person or whether it's technologically wise. And some of them are limited to only the in-person, so we want to make sure that those are safe and well thought out locations that we're doing that are large, well ventilated, the seating spaced enough so that the public does not have to sit on top of each other. The Delta variant really has, a number amongst other things, just caused us to to really think it through and be a little bit more anxious and a little bit more forward thinking on what we're doing. In fact, when we have gone to some of the communities that are lower vaccinated in our city or have lower vaccination rates in our city, we've done partnerships with our public health department to do a vaccine clinic at the redistricting workshop. The participants may not get vaccinated and come to our workshop, but we've done outreach to that regard, that we're having a workshop and we're doing a vaccination clinic. Come to one, come to both. But we would like, we put that out. When we've done outreach for those meetings, we actually do a paper flyer of the communities around that area that are low income or may not have high vaccination rates, to ensure that they get the paper in hand that says there's a redistricting workshop, but there's also a vaccination opportunity as well. So the hybrid model really gives people, I think, some flexibility and some comfort in participating, and yet doing it in the way that they feel the most comfortable doing.
Yeah, it seems like flexibility kind of is the key here, and definitely something that I think all of our local governments have been gotten very well versed in over the last 18 months, and just needing to be able to adjust as needed, have those in-person options when possible, but also have the virtual options, but thinking through some of the back end things too, like staffing that you mentioned, or working with other community partners to make sure that access is available for some of the folks that may not have that access at home. So a lot of moving pieces, but definitely keeping flexibility in mind there.
Yes, and I would just only add one other thing, that is the cost. There is a cost to doing that, and whether it's the overtime, whatever it may be, just understand that you need to build into that equation additional costs that you would normally not have when you were doing just a regular in-person meeting.
Definitely. We've gotten a couple of questions related to translation and interpretation. Is there any guidance in terms of the languages? I know, Mark, you mentioned some things that you're mandated to do. Is there anywhere that you guys can direct folks to get information about what their interpretation or translation requirements are?
Well, I think Ryan, you were going to say, I think it's within the Fair Maps Act, which has the requirements, and then I think on the Secretary of State's website, they identify what your language requirements, your minimal language requirements are. We have an interpretation service that helps us with city council meetings that we are using for redistricting meetings, and we've done meetings in Spanish. We've also provided our Armenian translation services for one of the meetings where a higher Armenian population was in that area, and we wanted to make sure that they were able to hear and understand the meetings. That kind of goes again. Doing the minimum is definitely what we are meeting, and doing beyond that is we do that where it's feasible and it makes sense and it will be beneficial to the community. And all of our literature is in English and in Spanish as we push that out and do that. And the all Spanish language workshop that we have coming up is just an acknowledgement to the high population of Spanish-speaking individuals that we have living in Pasadena, so to make sure that they are well informed of our process. Ryder.
Yeah, I would just a couple points. So the Secretary of State's office was obligated under the Fair Maps Act to identify the languages that people could request 72 hours in advance of a hearing itself for language translation, right? So it's not even like you're obligated to do that out the gate. You're obligated to be responsive if somebody requests it. Is my understanding of the law. I'm not the attorney in the room. But to Pasadena's point there, they basically said, we're not going to wait for the request. We're just going to make it available. And to some extent, that is if you can spend the money, that's the better way to go, because it's also, there's a lot of hearings going on, right? There's a lot of demand for interpreters. So you may not be able to secure that interpreter quickly. So just locking them down ahead of time can be the smart thing to do. And that does just kind of segue into one point that I want to raise, which is when we did redistricting 10 years ago, there were not nearly as many agencies as there are today. Cities and cities specifically, counties were, but cities didn't have as many districted agencies. Pasadena is unique for how long it's been districted. There is a huge number increase. I think it's almost an 8 or 10-fold increase in the number of districted cities in California. And you can look at the same for special districts throughout the state as well. That are facing this redistricting crunch that's going to go on here until April 2022. So that's just putting a lot of demand on consultants. It's putting a lot of demand on interpreters, on all these resources to simultaneously address these issues. So planning ahead for your interpretation services, locking down your contract resource is a good thing to do early. And if you just know going in, you're going to default to having these languages available, then all the more reason why you're able to lock down that resource.
And that's a great point, because a lot of the cities or a lot of the districts, cities that are districted are on this new timeline, whereas in LA County, they were on odd year elections. They are now, everyone is basically on that even year election. And so these deadlines are now applying to more cities that are dealing with redistricting, and so it just does impact the available finite resources that are for the technical redistricting and for outreach and for translation services and on down the board. So it just adds another layer of complexity that 10 years ago we didn't have. That we had 8 months to do redistricting, where now we are basically looking at 8 to 10 weeks, which is just not enough time to really do the mapping and the outreach that we would normally do with the community. We'd draw maps and get reactions to the maps before we started to compress them and bring them down to a manageable number. So that's going to be a challenge. We're still trying to think ahead of what's coming up to make that work and be successful.
Yeah, and I would just say, first of all, excellent point about that, Mark, too. It's not just an issue of the California Voting Rights Act creating more districted agencies, but it's also the consolidation of elections that has also forced that timeline even more tight. So you get this big spike now. The related, the other point I just want to make is it's also that now everybody's redistricting at the same time, right? So Mark's leading his efforts in Pasadena to communicate about redistricting. LA County has to redistrict too, right? So simultaneously with your voters hearing all about redistricting in Pasadena, they're also hearing about redistricting in LA County, perhaps. And then they need to hear about redistricting in Pasadena Unified School District, I believe, because Pasadena Unified is also districted. So now they're like, well, which one am I attending? Am I attending the redistricting for the county or the city or the school district. So that can create some complications too. You just have to message through that, something to think about as well.
No, that's a very good point. All of those points. I will make sure to drop the Secretary of State website into the follow-up email to you all so you guys can get more information about your translation requirements. I know we're really short on time. Ryder and Mark, if you've got a few minutes flexibility, would love to get through another couple questions with you all.
And then spoken longer than I should have. You can take my time.
I will, for the folks that need to drop off, I'm going to go back to the screen share here and get our contact information up for everybody. So feel free to follow up with us if you either need to drop off or if we don't get to your question here in the next couple of minutes, just want to make sure you guys are able to follow up with us as needed. But a couple of other questions that have come up that would love your thoughts on are, one, as we're going back to kind of these in-person events, any guidance on where you host them? Mark or Ryder, in your experiences, so are these going to be in areas that are going to perhaps be impacted by the redrawing of the maps, or are you really just looking for complete geographic parity? Any guidance or thoughts on locations of in-person meetings?
Yeah, so some of that, Mark, I'll take a first stab at this and you can jump in because obviously you've already done several of these and have some criteria. Fundamentally, you need to, first of all, know if you're planning on broadcasting these that are just going to be purely in person. Because if you're broadcasting, you face a fundamental question about internet access and reliable internet access, and that immediately narrows down your window of options. Then you look at spacing, lighting, existing AV infrastructure that could be supported, whether it's speaker, microphones, or full-on camera setup and whatnot, right? So if you can do it in council, if you're doing county work, but you can go council to council chamber and do it in their council chambers, that can be helpful. Obviously, some communities you certainly want to go where the people are, and maybe you want to go to a venue that is a little less political, right? So an Elks Lodge or some equivalent community hall forum that's an auditorium at a school district or something. You start to get some questions about internet access consistency, lighting, AV setup in those situations. But if you have a solution in a box and you can roll a team, then getting out to where the people are and going to something that's walkable or near their community is doable. I know for counties, like especially rural counties, walkable seems insane. So those would become kind of the additional options. We've done, at this point, I've done 3 workshops so far this year facilitated. One was at a boardroom for a school district. One was in a council chamber, and these are all for county workshops. One was in a county board of education professional training center. And the third was in a community, like a kind of a remote small community services facility attached to a school, a big high school in a very rural town in Fresno County. So it's really been all over the map, but you got to check those boxes of internet access and size and spacing. And then one just note on that, like size and spacing, that's a big question, of course, about how many people to expect. Pasadena has been extraordinarily I guess I would say fortunate in their participation rate. You see it all over the map, but having 20 plus people on Zoom, 30 people on Zoom, plus 20 people in the room for just these initial workshops and hearings before there's even maps drawn, I would just note is unusual. And I think National Demographics Corporation, who's done lots of redistricting work in the state of California, well over 150 agencies, could tell you, usually you don't start getting people showing up until lines are getting drawn. And up until then, it's relatively quiet. So it's a good reason to have recordings and information to make it available. I'd say that Pasadena being very geographically condensed, so access is easier, combined with extensive outreach tools, platforms that the city already had in place, combined with doing district by district mailings on outreach for their specific district outreach work, have all really compressed and amped up the amount of awareness on these issues and really driven up participation that you don't normally see this early in the process.
And yeah, those are all great points, and thanks for the compliments. We appreciate that. You know, what we tried to do 10 years ago, we did a district meeting or a redistricting meeting in each of the council districts. We made it a point to do that. We did the 3 initial ones were before maps were drawn, then we did 4 that were with the maps sort of drawn just to gauge the community and get some feedback on the maps. So this time it felt natural to look at doing it within each of the council districts because we are rather widespread. We wanted to make it close enough for people to attend if they wanted to in person. But the next factor that we tried to look at was the size of the location. Would it accommodate a good sized crowd and allow for social distancing? Was it technically advanced enough to have internet hardwired to ensure the reliability of the Zoom meeting? Needed good parking, needed to be ADA compliant, was a well-known location in the city. So what I started to think about, and it's sort of been a natural progression, going from census outreach, which is what we were doing, and then we were working on sort of the new vote center model in LA County. We looked at vote centers. Vote centers were large locations where the public had known to go to, and this redistricting is sort of a political process. It talks about boundary lines, so it was well known to the public in that sense. We make sure that all meetings are recorded, and then we post those meetings online. So each one of these workshops, even though they're identical, there's all sorts of different questions that come up at each of these meetings. So we do continue to make those accessible and maintain them online as part of the redistricting webpage. But when looking at sort of the locations and where and how, it really is, how to spread it out and make it equally accessible throughout the city. And again, the key thing to it is going to these sites and doing walkthroughs with your technical team to map it out, make sure that the room's big enough, make sure that it can meet the technical requirements. We had one snafu, and I'll talk about it just because it was a learning lesson for us. We normally put everything up on a projector, and so that everybody could see the PowerPoint presentation. When we went to one of the locations, we ended up using their 70-inch displays. The problem was when it came to the time to do the presentations and getting online, the mouse actually it was so highly pixelated they couldn't find the mouse, so they were having a technical issue to get through the actual presentation. So we sort of learned, let's not introduce new elements as we go through these processes. Let's try and maintain stability and make it sort of work similarly to each site, from site to site.
Yeah, one of those Murphy's Law situations, right? Always great to have a plan B and probably a plan C when it comes to any technology and hiccups that might come up.
That's correct.
A quick question: can you remind folks where they can get more information on the deadlines that are coming up? Is there a good single source of information that we can point people to?
For us, it's on cityofpasadena.net/redistricting. We have a full schedule, and it gives us the timelines for us. But I think that different agencies have different deadlines, and you should be in touch with your city attorney and your technical consulting team, if you have one, to sort of set those deadlines, if that's answering the question.
Yeah, I would say it varies, particularly if we're talking about other special districts outside of cities and counties. And if your cities and counties, it's fundamental. Like, when is your next election? If your next election is in June, your deadline is December 15th. If your next election isn't until November, your deadline is April 15th. So act accordingly. And I think maybe there's other questions here, right? So when do there's some other timing issues. You have to allow for people to submit draft maps before you produce maps yourself. You have to have a couple hearings pre-draft versus post-draft. So there's some timing nuances in how you do some of that stuff that is outlined. For example, if you go look at Mark's schedule in Pasadena, that's a really good kind of reflection of that prioritization. Mark's implementation is going through an advisory commission. I highlighted one of 3 methodologies for doing this. That those deadlines, for example, and the logistics around that would vary if you had an independent redistricting commission, right? If the independent redistricting commission can act without, can and does indeed act without council or board oversight, then it's their deadlines go up until arguably could go up until December. The argument there being, and this is a legal counsel question you need to have with your own agency, is if your independent redistricting commission adopts maps and takes that final action, does the county need to adopt formally through ordinance, or is it just considered a cleanup matter and the board of supervisors or city doesn't need to go through and adopt those maps after the independent commission has already done their job, right? So that's a legal question you need to get figured out, and you may get different interpretations from your attorneys on it. We've generally seen one interpretation being that it's just a cleanup item, and therefore you can go right up to that December 15th deadline to have your independent commission adopt maps and not require hearings for your board then, or even an action of your board to adopt by the 15th of December. You can just advance those. Again, check with your legal counsel.
Yeah,
and I would also say that you would just also need to go to the elections code, because the election code does identify the deadlines and the dates and the requirements and when you have to do things and when that has to be done. It's sort of sequential order, and you need to follow that to make sure you don't miss any of the key points of the Fair Maps Act that has those types of requirements.
And
yeah, so checking.
I'm sure Mark would tell you, like, you don't want to schedule a final hearing on December 14th, right? Like, if you can avoid it, you don't want to. If you can get out ahead of it, you never know, right? This is the nature of government. You never know when something's going to burble up to the surface and require you to do another quick hearing to get something done, and therefore you want to give yourself a little bit of room in case some crisis happens.
Yeah, so bottom line, it sounds like checking with your election code and your city attorney is a good place to start, and then making sure you're backtracking from there and those deadlines to do your due diligence and make sure you're holding your hearings at appropriate times and all of that. So a lot of moving pieces, but those would probably be the best places to start, would be with your agency counsel and your election code to make sure that you're meeting all of those requirements.
Yeah.
So to close us out, just would love to hear some quick thoughts from both of you on this balancing act that we're kind of working through right now. So I mean, you've got folks that are probably hitting that Zoom fatigue, that online meeting fatigue piece from doing this for 18 months. And then there's also going to be a lot of folks, obviously, that may not be comfortable going into an in-person environment quite yet with, the Delta variant or other vaccine challenges in some of our communities. So any guidance or high-level thoughts on trying to find that right balance for folks on the line as they're engaging in this, between the virtual and the in-person?
Yeah, Ryder, go ahead.
Mark, you first, buddy. I keep dominating these things. I'll let you get a word in. Go ahead.
Our focus has been to just try and make it allowing people to participate in the way they want to participate. So if you have the capability of doing a hybrid meeting process where they can participate via Zoom, where they can participate in person, that was a key point that was given to us by our task force, that they wanted, to go back to in-person meetings. It was at the time when rates were very low and we were coming out of all the tiers, and it was, things were starting to open up. So that's how we approached the planning for this. And then in the midst of it, it's sort of been this Delta variant has thrown another surprise, another curveball at us to make sure that we are doing whatever we can to make it safe. It's really trying to meet the public where they're at, but also trying to be as safe as possible and protect the public that are coming in. And so when we go out to do these in-person meetings, we do highlight and put it in all our messaging. This is a hybrid meeting, both online and in person. So participate how you feel comfortable and using that as a guide.
And I want to give a broader answer at the risk of kind of inflating this, but what is particularly unique about redistricting is super esoteric, and it only comes up every now and then, right? Only every 10 years. But it is also one of the few public policy areas where if an agency opts to, like Pasadena has done, opts for the mapping tools like Maptitude and District R, they opt for the set of tools, or ESRI if it's a bigger agency, they opt to make those tools available to the public. It's one of those few policy areas where the public actually has a chance to draw their own maps, right? To actually participate in crafting the solution. And I would liken it to if you were trying to develop a short-term rental ordinance, you would give your public a tool that would help them craft an ordinance by putting in variables for explaining what they want to get done and submitting that as their ideal ordinance. Here, because there's so many kind of mathematical and kind of red line legal elements involved, there are lots of tools available to really help people just draw those districts themselves. And the demographers we work with would tell you the ideal solution for any redistricting process is that it's ultimately an average citizen who submits a map that becomes the map that gets adopted, because the public has been empowered with this. And they would also tell you that, generally speaking, the most effective way to contribute information to the redistricting process is to draw a map. Just draw a map. It is, and that's something you can do. Admittedly, you can do. They have paper options that at least when we work with national demographics, they have paper options for people who don't have internet access, and then they have some online options as well. That is super powerful, super unique, great public relations, great way to empower the public. And of course, then you get the precursor to that, which is tell me about communities of interest. And the way to talk about communities of interest can be draw a circle on a map, write down a bolded list of those communities of interest and describe them in detail and what brings those communities of interest together. And then submit that in any way, shape, or form. I mean, you could draw on a map, take a photo of the map, and email it into usually every agency has set up a dedicated redistricting email address where that stuff can be submitted. I say all that because whether you are able to attend in person, you watch a YouTube video after the fact, you participate virtually through a Zoom session, all those methodologies are about giving information and learning, but fundamentally, the power that you have as a resident to participate is rooted in your ability to express either verbally in one of those forums or in writing or through mapping what your communities of interest are and how you think you want to be best represented. And there are lots of channels to help make that happen. That really kind of spans the gamut, no matter Delta variant coming and going, COVID on the rise or receding, hybrid or non-hybrid. Those channels are out there and available for the public to participate. And as long as we make sure that those submissions are all transparent, I think we engage in a really great process that reaches all corners.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And I know we've gone over, so thank you to the folks on the line for hanging in there with us and getting to hear this discussion, because I think this has been a really great way to share some additional tips and best practices from folks that are living and breathing this. So with that, I just again want to thank everybody on the line, and definitely a big thank you, Ryder, to you and Mark for sharing your morning/afternoon with us. Any final closing thoughts for our audience before we close everything out?
No, thank you very much for having us, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this.
Absolutely. Thank you, ILG, and the whole team there for doing what you guys do.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much. And again, to the folks that are still on the line, feel free to follow up with us, and we'll be sending out the slide deck and the recording shortly. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.